Hello, I'm Dr. Nathan Morris. I am the Farming Systems and Soil Specialist at NIAB, and I lead some of the long-term rotational work looking at cover crops, interactions with cultivations. We have regional centres, so here at Morley and other sites around the country, so we can really understand different agronomic impacts on different soil types with different rotations. Our head office at NIAB is in Cambridge, and we can then look at how we look at long-term rotation effects in long-term trials such as here at Morley, where we are very fortunate in having funding from the Morley Agricultural Foundation and the JC Mann Trust that have supported research looking at cover crops for 17 years now. So we started in 2007, so we can actually look at the impacts long-term across rotation of how cover crops can improve soil structure, build soil fertility, etc. Cover crops are really valuable as part of your diversification of looking at cover crops within rotation. There are many different species, and the selection of that is very dependent on actually what your objectives, what you really want to get out of a cover crop is. So for example, you may want to look at soil structuring, and for that you want something that's fast growing and has a deep taproot. So species such as brassicas have always in the past been popular because they're easy to grow, and well, they were easy to grow, and they have a good taproot for really opening up the soil structure. There are challenges, of course, with brassicas in the rotation now that we've become aware of that may mean that other species, so for example chicory and plantain, are also really good deep rooting species of cover crops, but have less of an implication on your rotation in terms of being a non-brassica species. They are also valuable in terms of, if you think about your cover crop species and types, if you have some of the legumes, some of the herb species, such as chicory, they are actually really valuable for grazing as well. So if you do have livestock in your area or on farm, you can actually use the grazing of the livestock as part of the management for cover crops. So always start with what you aim to achieve from using cover crops, and then go from there. Choosing species, you ideally would have a mix of species, not just a single species. That gives you diversity within the mix, but also if for some reason the weather does not allow one to grow, you will have other species that can grow and produce a good cover crop. So I always say a mixture of 3 or 4 species, but you can have more if you want. One of the considerations for cover crop selection, of course, will be the ease of sowing. So different seed sizes can be a challenge as well. They can settle out in your tank. So think a little bit about the seed size. And also, of course, cost. Cost is always something that we all have on our mind. So always look at what the cost of seed is. And quite often you can buy the seeds individually and mix on farm, which can be cheaper than buying a pre-mixed cover crop. So in terms of establishment of cover crops, there are many ways, and it will of course depend on your rotation and your soil type. There are relatively simple ways of broadcasting seed if the soil conditions post-harvest are adequate for that seed to soil contact. That's obviously a lower cost method. However, that can result in a more variable establishment. So, and of course it does depend on the conditions after harvest and how the previous crops being taken off, whether the straw has been chopped. Obviously if you have chopped straw, you can have trash that will impede the emergence of the cover crop. So just need to think a little bit about how you manage those harvest residues, and I would say that actually investing a little bit of time and money in establishment, so drilling the cover crop, will give you a much better establishment of that cover crop. Timing, of course, is always critical and can be a big challenge. That is one of the challenges of cover crops. I always say, if you're looking at cover crops, it is another crop you're growing. It is adding to complexity of your rotation. And of course, the timeliness of establishment of cover crops does coincide often with harvest. If you are looking at that autumn-winter period to get a cover over your soil. And that, of course, can lead to timeliness and labour challenges. So again, it's just think a little bit about how it will suit your rotation and your resource on farm in terms of establishment and timeliness of those. There's a lot of good work that has been done to show that early establishment is vital for the cover crop. So essentially, while there's still warmth and moisture, cover crops can really get a good head start, and you want that early burst of growth to really allow those roots to grow down. Later into the autumn, you tend to find slower establishment. The crops won't get as big in terms of their biomass, both above ground and below ground. And if you are thinking of what your aims and objectives are, particularly around soil structuring or nutrient capture, you really do want those roots to have the maximum opportunity to be able to restructure that soil. So here we are in the field with a long-term trial where we've been looking at the rotational performance of cover crops. It's been supported by the Morley Agricultural Foundation and the JC Mann Trust for really long-term studies, so we can actually look at the iterations of cover crops. So clearly you can see that the crop's all wheat this year, but we do obviously have a rotational cover crop within that. And we always, this trial in particular, has been looking at 4 cultivation approaches. So we have plough, which has always been ploughed to about 20 centimetres depth. We have a deep non-inversion, so that's a tine and disc cultivator, cultivating to about 20 centimetres. We have the same tine disc cultivator, cultivating to shallower 10 centimetre depth. And then we have a managed approach, where most farmers are obviously look at their previous yields or perhaps grass weed challenges, so it's managed in terms of the conditions. So we have that as a treatment. So the trial is crossed over with a cover crop that's a biocultivation species. So typically we've been looking at brassicas because those were really nice deep rooted. There are challenges, as I mentioned earlier, with the rotational integration of those. So we've now moved to a chicory and plantain mix. And we can see some of those benefits do take time to accumulate, so it's not something you can put a cover crop in once and then you get all your valuable increase in yield, moisture retention, workability, etc. Those actual measures take time to accrue. So over this 17-year period, we've had 7 iterations of cover crops, and within that we can see changes in the status of soil bulk density. So that's like your packing density of the soil. And obviously the lower the bulk density, improved porosity, improved drainage. We've also seen changes in actually the pattern of performance in the crops. So when we first started here, we always found that the site's a sandy loam, so it's not that stable. The soil does tend to need some cultivation because of the sand content to keep it open. So where we've ploughed, we tend to get the highest yields. There's obviously a consideration there in terms of the cost and the timeliness of those ploughing operations. They're quite slow. So we actually find that the non-inversion tillage systems obviously help to reduce that timeliness of the cultivations, but they also allow us to look at improvements in crop yield over time. So where we've had the cover crop and moved away from ploughing, we now actually see comparative performance to the plough-based system, but obviously with those lower establishment costs. We have done some work where we've looked at the energy required to produce. So we look at the megajoules per tonne of production. So it's, if you like, an efficiency measure. And we've actually now found that the shallow non-inversion with cover crop is the most efficient system. And that's something that, you know, we've had to wait a few years for, but has been really good to show. And the workability of the soil, that's something that cover crops can help, particularly with their rooting structure. They do open up the soil. I mentioned the lower bulk density. It's harder to look at the workability of the soil. Ideally, we would like to take draft measurements but we do see there's improvements in the workability. When we look at soil structure, we do the visual evaluation of soil structure, the VEST score, and that's a really nice semi-quantitative approach just to look at your structure, and you can see how the soil is more friable after cover crops. So we can use cover crops to build organic matter to our soils, although it's not a very precise approach for building organic matter. So organic matter does take a very long time to build in soils. It's not something we can change overnight, whether that's using cover crops or whether it's incorporating manures. It does take time. If we consider cover crops, we usually expect to have about 1 to 3 tonnes of organic material being incorporated, depending on the species of cover crops. If we compare that to a typical soil amendment, a manure application, that usually applies 5 to 6 tonnes. So we do get a bit less of organic material being applied through cover crops. The other challenge with cover crops that you can get is depending on your species, but some of the species have they all have different carbon nitrogen ratios, and that will determine their breakdown. So something that breaks down quite quickly will have a low carbon nitrogen ratio, and that can be valuable in terms of just reducing the overall trash or residues that you get, which can implicate on how you establish the following crop. So you want a component of what I say a low lignin material that will break down quickly. You will also want some higher lignin material. So when I say higher lignin, it's just a more woody type material that will actually break down more slowly and will contribute to that longer term organic matter pool. So it's not something that's particularly easy to do. What you can do in terms of increasing organic matter supply to your soils is using cover crops in your rotation, and repeated use will build up not just the organic matter, but will also build up the organisms, for example earthworms, and then your macro fauna and your invertebrates, other invertebrates that will actually be breaking down that material in your soil and cycling it. And that can also be, if you like, turbocharged by adding organic matter through amendments as well in your rotation. So if you can use cover crops and organic material, as well as reducing your cultivation. So if you can move away from ploughing, perhaps to a rotational basis, if not completely, to basically allow that material to be as a food source. So things like earthworms do need a constant food supply. So if you're inverting the soil, you're moving all those residues down into the depths of the soil where those earthworms are less likely to be able to use it. So you want to keep a surface of residues, and if at all possible, maintaining cover for as much as the year as possible, which is where cover crops are really valuable, because you've got your cash crops, as I call them, but in terms of once you've harvested those, if you get a cover crop in, then that continues that supply through to allow those animals to be nutrient cycling and breaking that down into organic matter. So one of the great opportunities that we have with long-term trials such as this, and again this is supported through the Morley Agricultural Foundation and JC Mann Trust, allows us to build long-term results through integrating with cover crops into the rotation, but it also allows us to do new studies and to get funding to support other ways of looking at the value of cover crops. So we've just been fortunate in having the support of a DEFRA-funded project that's the Centre of High Carbon Capture Cropping. That's a multi-partner long-term trial that will look at elements of cover cropping and how those cover crops can build soil organic matter and organic carbon. So hopefully we'll have some really interesting results to see how these long-term trials, where we've actually had cover crops in, as I said, 7 times through the duration of the project, we'll be able to actually see how that's building our carbon in the soils.